I'm a pretty big fan of video game soundtracks, and when a company called Data Discs reached out to us to send us a bunch of their albums for review, I was pretty excited. But then I found out the format in which they release their albums, and folks, I just got a whole lot more curious, because they release vinyl records of old video game soundtracks. How do these sound, and are they even worth picking up? Well, let's find out. There are a lot of video gamers out there that really enjoy listening to soundtracks from their favorite video games. Most likely they're listening to them on streams or through digital files, or in some cases, maybe they're listening to them off digital audio CDs. But I know for a fact that the majority of you watching right now probably don't own a record player. And why would you? It's a much older technology, and unless you're an audiophile, it's likely not something you would have got into. Now this is an obvious departure from what we typically do on Rerez talking about video games, but this is video game related, and I hope that this video is going to answer two questions for you. Number one, is it difficult to get into playing records in the first place? And number two, is it even worth it to listen to video game soundtracks on vinyl? Well, let's take a look at the first question. Both the cost and difficulty of getting into playing vinyl records is going to range all over the place, but we decided to show you the two extremes. The first one is the absolute cheapest way you can get into it. So we went online and bought the cheapest record player we could possibly get, and this is what we got. The Sylvania USB turntable player, and folks, let me tell you, it is pretty cheap, but it has a couple of neat features. For one, it plugs up directly to a USB port to charge its internal battery, because yeah, it has one of those, and that battery allows you to take it anywhere you want with built-in speakers and listen to records on the go. This package comes with everything you're gonna need, including the stylus, which is that little needle thing that hits the record. This is basically it. If you've got this, you can play records immediately. This is a pretty neat piece of technology that's going on here, but at the end of the day, it isn't a premium device. But through our experience, it ended up sounding pretty good. But could it sound better? Well, we visited Forch's record store in Cambridge, Ontario to talk to the owner Paul about everything vinyl. Paul gave us some tips about proper handling and playing procedures for records, and this is the guy that knows it, because he basically deals with records 24/7. And when it comes to using classic wax disc formats, careful handling is paramount. Taking care of vinyl records is just like taking care of optical discs, but unlike optical discs that tend to be a little bit more durable, vinyl records can sometimes damage a bit more easy. Basically how this works is that if you were to touch an optical disc on the back and smudge it, sometimes it would be very difficult for the laser to actually read what is on the disc. When it comes to vinyl records though, they actually have grooves in the wax, and that groove is basically where all the information is held, so you don't really want to touch that directly. Vinyl records are typically packaged in sleeves, and when you remove them from the sleeves, you want to make sure that you're holding the edges of the record, or if you need to, the center label area. You want to make sure you don't want to touch any of the grooves and transfer it safely to the record player itself. Once the record is on the turntable, all you need to do now is play it. Usually the record players are going to vary all over the place, but essentially they all should have this basic function. They should be able to spin, and there should be a needle or a stylus that you can bring over and gingerly lay down on the vinyl itself. But if you did everything right, you should start to hear this. Crisp, clean, wonderful sounding music. And although you will hear pops and things like that every so often, a good record player would actually be very minimized in that. What's interesting though is that the way you take care of the record can actually elongate the lifespan of these things, and in some instances, it can actually make the music sound a lot better. You'll want to keep dust off the records, or if you need to, you can use cleaning solutions to really get them clean if there's a big mess on them. But in general, if you're buying new records, you really shouldn't have to worry about that. So if there is dust, you just use a record brush. All you do is you follow the grooves of the record and then eventually just slide it off slowly, and that way you get all the dust off and you can have a nice clean record to play. But dust can also collect on the stylus, so you may also need to get a stylus brush as well. These things are not that expensive, but they can make the performance of these records playing amazingly better. It was around this time we started to notice there was a lot of similarities between keeping records and collecting video games. For both, you want to keep them in a pretty temperature-controlled environment that isn't too hot and isn't too cold and has low moisture, because that stuff can damage old video games and it can also damage old records. But not only that, the way you keep them clean and keep them safe is essentially the same. Just carefully handle and store your stuff and it should last for a very long time. So as you can see, it's not really that difficult to get into playing and keeping records. But what does change is the price of the hardware. Now, as we mentioned, we got a very cheap all-in-one solution. But Paul over at Forch's record store, well, he had something a little bit more premium. And what we wanted to do was basically compare our cheap setup to the more expensive one. But keep in mind, all of the audio that you're hearing has been compressed into a digital video, which means that it's not going to sound as high quality as it would if you heard it in real life. First, let's listen to the opening track of Shenmue on our cheaper setup. Now let's listen to it on the more expensive setup. In person, the difference between the two setups is huge. The cheaper option is just, well, a lot cheaper. It's got smaller speakers and smaller tech behind it, and it probably doesn't have the best stylus in the world. But the more expensive one has a lot more going behind it, and because of that, you can hear a lot more of the sound that you're simply incapable of hearing with this one. But that doesn't mean that this one is necessarily useless. The sound is still pretty decent, it's just not as good as what you could be getting if you just got a little bit more into the hardware game. For around twice or maybe even 3 times as much as we spent on the cheaper setup, you can get a far better setup that doesn't really cost all that much more, but it'll give you a better sound in the end. So to answer our first question, no, it's really not that difficult to get into record playing. And to be fair, it's not that expensive either, especially if you went on the hunt to some pawn shops. Remember, a lot of this technology is decades old, and most of it will work just as well now as it did back then. Some components like the rubber belts on the turntables or the stylus might need replacing, but generally those aren't very expensive to get. But now let's focus on our second question. Is there a reason for gamers to go out and get these soundtracks on vinyl? Is there really a difference that's worth it? Well, let's look into this a bit more. Every record we're going to be looking at today is from Data Discs. Now, these guys put a lot of effort and time into getting old video game soundtracks and remastering them for vinyl. Now, this means that they go through a bunch of different methods to capture the original soundtrack and bring it to this source, but the way they do that varies from game to game. The first soundtrack we're looking at is Altered Beast. This is a classic late 80s video game that is incredibly fun to play. The album art itself is wonderfully hand-painted and looks amazingly detailed. Sometimes on small releases on compact discs, you'll miss those really cool details because the image is just so much smaller. And when it comes to digital releases, well, you usually don't get real album art with that. Sometimes you do, but it's just really small and it's insignificant. When it comes to listening to vinyl records, it's more of the experience. And not only that, when you actually open this thing up, you get a big poster inside as well. The majority of records you're likely to find out in the wild are going to be black vinyl, but this one here is an opaque orange vinyl that looks really cool. But how does it sound? Well, let's drop the needle. If you were to go online and stream the Altered Beast soundtrack from some random source, usually you'll actually find a soundtrack that's been emulated. What that means is that it's being done through software and you don't get the original hardware sounds. With this here though, you're not getting that. The folks at Data Discs went out and sourced a Japanese Model 1 Mega Drive, and through that they captured the video game audio directly. They even list the motherboard that was on that system so that you can know exactly which system was being used. This goes a little bit of a step beyond what you would typically find when it comes to listening to these soundtracks online. The original Sega Mega Drive, otherwise known as the Sega Genesis, had a sound chip in it that gave it a very specific noise. These sound chips differ from console to console, and in some cases, if you were to have a game that was released on 2 platforms at once, like let's say the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, the sounds would be very different. And that unique harmony that you would get with the the Sega Mega Drive is what they're trying to capture with this vinyl record. A vinyl record isn't a digital format, and what it is essentially is just a vibration that's being recorded into wax. And by that definition itself, it means that it is going to be far higher quality and uncompressed, meaning that you should probably hear a lot more in this sound than you typically would have heard from the original recordings that you would find on a digital format. This exact same method of recording was replicated with Revenge of Shinobi. They once again used a Mega Drive Model 1 so they could get the best sound quality out of the cartridge and into the record itself. Let's have a listen. Just like with Altered Beast, you get a lot of really nice high-quality artwork with this album, but you also get an additional piece of artwork that on the back has a small little interview with the creator of the soundtrack himself. This is a nice little touch because some of the stories that they talk about here are actually pretty interesting. The vinyl record itself is produced in a way to kind of make it look like a splatter painting. It's really interesting to see this, and it looks really cool while it's spinning on the turntable. Even though I'm using a cheaper turntable, both of these albums sound wonderful, just like they're playing directly from a Sega Genesis. But what would happen if you were to take something that was a little bit more complex, like say an arcade machine, and take those sounds directly from that hardware and capture it on vinyl? Well, it would sound like this. What you're listening to now is the soundtrack to Space Harrier. And what's so great about this is they've captured the direct audio straight from an arcade machine so that you can get the highest quality sound ever. This is so important because for many people out there, they probably have never heard what the original soundtrack sounds like directly from an arcade machine. The same capture method was also used for Galaxy Force 2 and Thunderblade. And on this album, you get both soundtracks on either side of the vinyl disc. As you've probably come to expect, both of these albums come with very high quality artwork, and they also come with colored vinyls. And while every single album we've listened to so far sounds great, there's a little bit of a debate in these albums existing at all. Most people out there that collect vinyls are collecting them for analog sounds being captured in vinyl records. That means they're looking for basically really high quality sound effects being captured in the best possible way they can find. And that's basically why vinyl has still survived to this day. But for many people out there that think about Sega Genesis or arcade machines, they don't see a reason for capturing what essentially is a digitized sound chip being captured in vinyl. Are you really capturing that much detail that you couldn't hear from the original hardware? And wouldn't a digital sound file be able to capture the same quality audio? Well, from my own personal experience, I really can't tell the difference. A digital sound file and the songs I was hearing on the vinyl records sound pretty much identical, but that doesn't mean that the vinyl records aren't actually giving you added depth and clarity, it's just that I can't hear it. But that doesn't mean I don't think you should get these albums. Specifically, if you're a fan of one of these games, having this album is a very interesting way to listen to the music. With modern digital technology, if we happen to buy an album, we usually just focus on the one song that we like and avoid all the others. But with these vinyl records, you're basically forced to listen to the beginning all the way to the end, giving you a very different feel for what the music is trying to do. And although many of these songs were originally composed for video games, listening to them in this way is just kind of interesting. Sitting there and just looking at the artwork and taking in the music for what it is. It's a unique experience and one that I feel a lot of gamers out there might really enjoy. But when it comes to the next records we're about to cover, I feel that these ones specifically stand out and could be appreciated by pretty much anyone out there that just enjoys good, high-quality music. Earlier on in the video, you already heard music from Panzer, Dragoon, and Shenmue, and both of these albums sound fantastic because of the way that they were captured originally. Both of these games were originally produced on optical discs that made use of digitally compressed audio files. These audio files at the time were very high quality and they sounded great, but on a vinyl record, having them uncompressed, they sound even better. There's a warmth and clarity to listening to these soundtracks on vinyl that you simply wouldn't get from the original video game consoles themselves. And that also means that playing a game that had a sound test menu where you could just listen to the music by itself, it still wouldn't sound as high quality as what you're getting here. That's the point, I believe, that makes these vinyl records so important. Because if you are a big enough fan of Shenmue or Panzer Dragoon, you simply have to pick these up and listen to what they sound like. Even though these albums are really about the vinyl records themselves, what you're getting inside of them is a little bit of extra stuff like artwork and stuff like that. But when it came to the final album we're looking at, they really went all out. This is the soundtrack to Policenauts, a newly remastered version for the very first time on vinyl that's also a double LP with its own individual art book inside. This right here is the most premium of all the records that were sent in, and it simply is worth it. Being able to sit down and listen to the entire soundtrack while looking at this art book is really an experience unto itself. As I mentioned previously, that's just the way you should be exploring these albums, but with this one, because of the added extra material, it just goes a little bit longer. This really does make a very big impact on me, especially since I'm such a big fan of Policenauts, and I feel that for many gamers out there that are also a fan, they might really want to get this. Every single one of these albums was officially licensed from the original property owners, and for some reason, seeing Policenauts like this almost made me feel like Konami was willing to work more with that property, and maybe, just maybe, we might see a remaster sometime. But even if we don't, it's still nice to see this soundtrack presented in this way. Data Discs has done an incredible job at taking all these old video game soundtracks and capturing them in a vinyl format. If you're a fan of any one of these soundtracks and you want to hear it in the most uncompressed method possible, this is simply the best way to do it outside of playing the original games. I really want to thank Data Discs for sending in these records to us so we could listen to them. And I also want to thank Paul over at Fortress Records for allowing us to film in his store. And I also want to thank Terrence and Mike who got me into listening to records in the first place, because they're the ones that introduced me to these things way back a couple years ago. If you're interested in listening to more of their reviews on stuff, head over to Video Game Soundtracks. You'll find links to all this stuff in the description below.